Today's daf is Chai Yud Ches, and we were speaking yesterday in the previous daf Yud Beis about the structure of tefillah and the sequence of the brachos. So we move on in that sugya. We're up to line 4. Avon Shebas Tefillah Bas Avod. In other words, after we conclude with our bakoshos, then we get to the bracha of avoda. Shenemar, what's the connection between tefillah and avoda? Why does one contiguous to the other? Olosehem v'zivchehem l'ratzon al mizbechi. And this pasuk is indicative of the fact that we want ratzon. That's why the bracha of what we call avoda is called ratzon, ritzei. And ritzei is something that you ask for after tefillah or after a carbon. You ask for what's called ritzui carbon or ritzui tefillah, that Hashem should accept our karbonos and our tefillah. Kevan shebas avoda bas toda. Once we get to the avoda, the bracha of ritzei ends with hamachazir shchina sol etzion. Then immediately we are ready for the bracha of Toda, which means we're now involved in thanks, in expressing Hodoya Tashem. Shenemar, as the Pasuk says. Now, until now, we've been dealing with the Pasuk in Yeshayahu and Navi. Now, we're moving on to Tehil. And in Tehil, David HaMelech says, Toveach Toda Yichabdinini. And by bringing a carbon Toda, you give honor to me, God declares. And this is why we have what's called a carbon Toda. Now, the essence of the bracha of Toda concludes with the fact that Masechet Yomi. And some say that the Masechet Yom is the fact that God is willing to meet with us in tefillah, to accept our bakoshos and our tefillos, our tshuva, even though we're far away from Him. We haven't really achieved what we have to, the level that we have to, but that's a greatness, a miracle of God that He accepts our tefillah, no matter where we are and what level we've gotten to. Why is it that contiguous following Hodah, we have Birchas Kohanim? What's the connection between the two? And the truth is that we're talking about Tfilas Hatzibur. We're no longer talking about Tfilas Yachid. This is a kind of a critical point in which we are at the crossroads. Until now, everything was for a Yachid, individual. Now we're talking about Birchas Kohanim integrated in Tefillah. That's only in the case of Tfilas Harabim. The Pasuk says, "Vayisa Aaron es yadav el ha'am vayavarachem vayerid ma'asos hachatos ve'ola ve'ashlamim." And the Torah here in Vayikra Perek Tes is describing the situation of Aaron after he brought the sacrifice. So after the Akravas HaKarbanos, Vayisa Aaron es yadav, he raised his hands, and Vayivarchim, and he blessed the people. So based on this pasuk, that following the avoda, we have Birchas Kohanim. That's why we put the Birchas Kohanim after Hodah, close to avoda. But the Gemara says, Heima Kodam avoda. Maybe if you want to connect Birchas Kohanim to the avoda, maybe you should insert Birchas Kohanim either into avoda or maybe before avoda, so it's connected to the avoda. And instead, you wedge Hodah in between avoda and Birchas Kohanim. Lo sal kedai. That is not a possibility. The siv, because if you look at that same pasuk, it says, "Vayered me'asos hachatos." In other words, he had already brought the chatos, and then Vayisa Aaron es yoda vayvarachem. Miksiv lasos. It doesn't say that he's going to perform, but me'asos ksiv, meaning in the lashon of avar, he's already brought the karbanos and performed his avoda, and now subsequent to the avoda, he will bless the people. So the Gemara immediately asks, "V'lemra achar avoda." Why is it that you wedge in hodah between avoda and birchas kohanim? If Aaron was mevarach the am right after the avoda, then we should be reciting the birchas kohanim immediately after the avoda. Lo sakadaitu. That's impossible. Why? Tichsiv, because the pasuk says zoveach toda, that the zevach has to be a zevach toda, and that's what's going to be the carbon that ends the entire service of the avoda, so that when we recite modim, that brach of modim is really integral to avoda. It's not a separate entity called avoda. A lot of people think that v'chol hachaim yeducha sela, etc., is a separate entity. It's not. It's really an extension and a continuation of the avoda, because the avoda terminates with the zevach toda. And therefore, our brach of hodah, which is a replacement of the zevach toda, will come immediately after the brach of avoda v'tzeh, which ends with a machzir shchina solet tzion. So the Gemara asks, "Mais chazis the samchas ahani, smocha hani." You have two psukim over here. One pasuk seems to indicate that the carbon toda and the kiyum of hodah to thank Hashem comes after the avodah. However, the other pasuk indicates that the birchas kohanim of Aaron took place after the avodah. Correct? What does the pasuk say? It says vayered me'asos hachatos, and then immediately vayisa Aaron es yada. So on the one hand, you're telling me that the avodah completes itself with zevach toda, and if we have hodah afterwards, but on the other hand, immediately after the avodah, Aaron performed the birchas kohanim. Where answers mistabra avodah vodah chana milsi, since the end of the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, after all the korbanos were brought, the clincher and the finale is korban toda. Therefore, it makes sense that hodah should be integrated into the avodah. What's the relationship between birchas kohanim and sim shalom? They are contiguous. There must be some relationship. The sim in the parsha of birchas kohanim in Parshas Naso, it says v'somu shmi al bnei Yisrael v'niyavarchem, and it means that God is bestowing a bracha. So the kohanim are sort of the conduits to bring the bracha of Hashem down. And what is the bracha of Hashem? Bracha d'Hakadosh Baruch Hu shalom. It's going to be shalom. And how do we know this? Shedemar, because the pasuk says in Tehillim, Hashem yivarech es hamo v'shalom. So the ultimate bracha of Hashem, the essence of all brachas, in effect, is the bracha of shalom. Shalom means shleimus, it means perfection, it means peace, it means getting close to Hashem. All this is included on the shalom. So when it says Yisa Hashem panavei lecha, it's going to end with Yasem lecha shalom, and therefore the birchas hashalom belongs immediately after birchas kohanim. Now the Gemara asks the following question: You have a strange kind of situation here. On the one hand, it's 120 elders that made up the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah with prophets amongst them. They established the blessings of Shmona Esrei, and yet Shimon HaPikuli, according to the Brisa, was the one who arranged the tefillah. So who actually arranged the tefillah? Was it the 120 members of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, or was it Shimon HaPikuli? So the Gemara says, Shechachu v'chazav v'sidrum. Initially, the entire sequence of Shmona Esrei was established by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, but unfortunately got forgotten. Again, they didn't have printed Sidurim in those days. And Shimon Apikuli was the one who restructured the tefillah, and he arranged them in the correct order. And that's why we have Shmon Esrei as we know it today. And that's because Shimon Apikuli had not forgotten the Seder Avodah that was established by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. Once he has completed the Shmon Esrei, now he cannot add any additional praises to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This Gemara, by the way, is not addressing the issue of adding your own bakashos, your own petitions. You want to add praise to Hashem, like as if you're saying that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah didn't do justice to God. There are more descriptions and adjectives that we can use to describe the Almighty, but we're not allowed to do so. We're only allowed to use the Shvach as it was organized and formulated by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. The Omer Rabbi Lazar, my detziv miyam alel kvus Hashem yashmiya kol pilaso. And this pasuk in Tehillim is what you call what's it called when you ask a question? A rhetorical question. David HaMelech is asking rhetorically, who can declare all the praises of Hashem? And the answer is no one. We learned this before, that no one is capable of declaring all the praise of Hashem. Who would be fitting? Who would be suitable? The appropriate candidate to describe all the greatness of God, the mighty acts of God. Only someone who could give all the praises. He can't start with the praise and not complete. He can't do a half-baked job, but no one is capable of declaring all the praises of Hashem. And therefore, you don't even begin. Don't begin something, because the Gemara says in Brachos that if you begin the praises of Hashem, then somebody's going to ask you, Ad Kan? That you've covered all your bases? That's all the greatness of Hashem? It's endless. It's infinite. And by the way, my Rebbe used to always call this a brisker concept called a matir. To say praise Hashem needs a matir. Who are you, man, finite and limited to praise Hashem? And the matir is that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah obligated you in reciting this praise. But beyond that, you have no matir. If a person continues praising Hashem beyond what the Anshe Knesset Gedolah established, nekar min ha'olam, that's a very severe punishment. He'll be uprooted from this world, shenemar. And now the Gemara quotes a pasuk in Iyov with a new drasha on this pasuk. Hayisupar lo ki adaber imamar ish ki yevula. Can God be told of all His praises that I may express an abundance of praise? If a man says to do this, he will be swallowed up. A very severe punishment for someone who claims that he can tell of all of God's praises. Darash Rabbi Yudish Kfar Giboraya, the Amile Ish Kfar Gibor Chaya. Apparently, the two people with the same name, they each came from a different village. My Sid, what does the pasuk mean in Tehillim when it says L'cha Dumya Tehillah? And by the way, we quoted this pasuk at the beginning of Masechet Megillah to derive the chiyuv to read the Megillah twice, if you remember Rabbi Shimon Levi. Silence is your praise, meaning sometimes it's really good to be silent. Sama de kula mashtuka, and silence is the best medicine that you can get. What does it mean? Silence in terms of relating God's praises. The Asr Abdimi Omar, Abdimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, and he said, Amri B'Amarofa, we said in Eretz Yisrael, Mila B'Sela Mashtuka B'Train. If you would value a word at one seller, then silence is worth twice that amount. It's worth two. And again, you have to use your power of speech properly and not to relate all of God's praises, because no one can relate all of God's praises. The Mishnah says, Kra al Pelo Yotzef, he reads the Megillah by heart. Without a ksav, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Now imagine a person who knows the Megillah by heart. And by the way, that's not rare. Many people know the Megillah by heart, but they're not Yotze unless they read it from a Megillah. Omar Rava, Asya Zchira Zchira, Ksiv Hacha Vayom Ma'ilim is Karim, Uksiv Hasam with regard to the mitzvah of Amalek, it says Ksov Zos Zikaron Basefer, in a sefer. Malon Basefer, just like in Amalek it says Bas Sefer. So to Afkan here with regard to Purim, Af Kan Basefer, it has to be from a sefer. So the Gemara immediately objects. Umimai, the high Zechira, when the Torah speaks about Zechira, Ksov Zos Zikaron Basefer, Kriyahi, who says Bechlal that with regard to Amalek, there's a mitzvah of Kriya? Dilma Iyun Bialma. Maybe you look at the words, you think of the context, and you remind yourself from Amalek, and you fulfill the mitzvah Zechira. So how do you know that you have to read from a text? Maybe you don't have to read it all. The Gemara is a little bit strange over here because certainly, even if you know in your mind about Amalek, the halacha requires that you read it, even if you don't have to read it out loud, but you have to look into the ksav. And that should be already a source from which we could derive that the Megillah has to be mitoch haksav. But in any event, in the case of Amalek, the Gemara is arguing that since the essence of the mitzvah is to remember Amalek, who says that you have to read it? Maybe just remember it. It's a mental exercise. Lo sal kedai, that can't be so. Because it says Zocha. And the Brisa tells us Yachol Balev. Maybe you would think, as we thought before, it's enough to think about it. Omer, Lo Tishkach, the Torah says, do not forget Amalek. Hare Shechas Alev Omer, meaning you have to remember so that you don't forget. Hamani Mekayim Zochar. Why then did the Torah add a positive command of remembering? And the answer is Bapeh, that you have to recite it Bapeh, and it's got to be Mitoch Haksav, and the same halach applies in parallel to Kriyas HaMegillah. And by the way, there's a famous insight here of the Achronim that they want to say that when you read the Megillah, you also get a kiyum, a mitzvah of Zechiras Amalek because of home. Kra Targum lo yotza. If he reads it in Targum, he's not yotze. Hey chidomi, what's the case? Ilam the ksiva mikra. V'karli Targum. If it's written in Hebrew, and he reads it in Targum, is Hainu al Peh, then he's reading it by heart. He's not reading it from the Ksav. So we already have that psul. You don't have to give me another category called Kra Targum. There must be a new Kiddush, and you're breaking new ground in the case of Kra Targum. So Tzricha, what's the case of the Mishnah, the Ksiva Targum? It's written in Targum, the Karle Targum, he's reading it from the Megillah in Targum. And this is invalid. Why? Because the only language that you could be Yotzi in is in Lashon Kodesh, not in Targum. Avol solo laws is the laws, but wait a second. The Mishnah itself says that you could read it in a foreign language. So in the case of Targum, why can't I read it in Targum? But apparently, in the case of Targum, we don't really assume that it's a spoken language, it's a vernacular that people understand. When the Mishnah allows you to write the Megillah in a foreign language and read it for foreigners, those are the foreigners that understand that language. Gemara asks, Va'amrit kra v'chaloshon lo yatsa. On the one hand, the Mishnah says that if you read the Megillah in any other language, you're not Yotzei. Now you're telling me Belaz is Lalaz and you Yotzei. Rav and Shmuel, the Yomi Travayu, when it says that you can read it in Laz is Lalaz, it's referring to Yavani. And the Gemara is going to have a problem with this because the Mishnah doesn't mention Yavani, the Greek language. But in any event, we'll solve that problem a little bit later on. According to Rav and Shmuel, this Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rav Shimon Gamliel, which we had back on Daf Ches, that the Greek language is upgraded to a special status. And therefore, although other languages would be disqualified for the reading of Megillah, but Greek language is acceptable. Hechidami, what's the case? If it's written in Hebrew and he's reading it in Greek, I know Al-Ped, then he's reading it by heart, and that's possible. So how can you possibly say that he could be Yotze with a valid Kriya when he reads it in Greek? It's written in Hebrew. And the answer has to be, Omar of Acham Rav Losa, Shiksuv Velaz Yivanis. It's written in Greek. So the Megillah is written in Greek, he's reading it in Greek, and the people understand Greek. Not today. Today we don't have Greek. All the languages got mixed up. The Greek that the Gemara has in mind which according to Rav Shimon Gamliel is elevated to a special status, and he permits Hebrew and Greek. That's the Greek of the ancient Greeks. Now, this is another statement of Rav Acha in the name of Rabbi Elazar. It has nothing to do really with our sugya. But once you mentioned him about Megillah that was written in Yavanis, now we mention the fact that God called Yaakov Kel. Kel is the mighty one. Shenemar, and here we have a pasuk which can be read in two different ways. It's what you call a dangling modifier. You don't know exactly. It's in Bereshis Perek Lamed Gimel. It says Shenemar Vayikra Lo Kel Elokei Yisrael. Now, how do you read that? Vayikra Lo, it sounds like Yaakov Avinu is calling Kel. He's calling God Elokei Yisrael. So the Gemara rejects that interpretation, even though that's the first the conclusion you would jump to. It says the Isal Kedaituk Lumizbeach Kori Le Yaakov Kel. The previous pasuk is talking about Yaakov establishing the Mizbeach, and immediately after he sets up the Mizbeach, it says Vayikra Lo, and he called it Kel. So that means he's calling the Mizbeach Kel. And not only that, if somehow you could justify the word Kel as a description to the Mizbeach, then Vayikra Lo Yaakov Miboil. It should have pointed out in the pasuk that it was Yaakov who's doing the calling. Why was Yaakov's name omitted here? Ella, but let's reinterpret the pasuk. Vayikra Lo LiYaakov Kel, and he with a capital H, the Almighty, called Yaakov Kel. So we just added one word here, LiYaakov, not Vayikra Yaakov, but rather Vayikra Lo LiYaakov. He called him, meaning Yaakov Kel. Okay, now we get back to the machlokas that we had before about reading the Megillah in a foreign language. We have a kash on Rav and Shmuel, because Rav and Shmuel said that Greek is a unique language and it's elevated to a separate category, such that you could read it in Greek from a Greek text. But we have a brayso that says Kra Giftis, Ivris, Elamis, Modis, Yevanis, Lo Yatsa. And included on this list of different kinds of languages, you have Greek. Now, according to Rav and Shmuel, Greek can be read, and you can be Yotze Megillah. And yet, this brayso says explicitly, including Greek, Lo Yatsa. The fact that the other languages are mentioned here and they're disqualified, that's not a problem. But the problem is, Rav and Shmuel said there was one foreign language which was elevated to the status of Yotza, and that's Greek. But why is Greek on this list? And the Gemara says, Holodamya el laha. You have to consider, what did Rav and Shmuel mean when they said that you could be Yotze in Greek? Giftis, legiftim, ivris, leivrim, elamis, leelamim, yevanis, leyevanim, Yotze. It means that the brayso disqualifies all the other languages because he doesn't understand those languages. But if he understands those languages, then he can be Yotze in those languages. And therefore, when Rav and Shmuel say that you're allowed to use Greek, they meant to say that if you understand Greek, then you can be Yotze with Greek. So the Gemara says, if that be the case, then Rav and Shmuel, amai mukile l'mastisin bilaz yivanis, lukme b'chol las. Right, the brayso says that you can be Yotze if you're Coptic in Coptics, and so forth and so on. Any language whatsoever, as long as it's your language and you understand it. So why did Rav and Shmuel limit it to the case of Yevanis? It should have been any language. And indeed, the Mishnah doesn't specify Yevanis. Ella, therefore, the Gemara says, Mastisim kibrayso. our Mishnah should be interpreted just like we saw in this price, which means all languages can be used for the Megillah, as long as you understand that language. The statement of Rav and Shmuel was not relating to the Mishnah, but that's how they pass. Rav and Shmuel, the Amit Shavai, Laz Yevani Lakol Kosher. Unbelievable. Just like anyone could understand, it could be Yotze with Ivrit, with Lashon Kodesh, even though he doesn't understand a word of the Megillah. So too, if the Megillah is written in Greek and read in Greek, anyone could be Yotze, even if he doesn't know a word of Greek. It's all Greek to him. And that's because of the Shita of Rav Shimon Gamliel, who elevated the status of Yevonis and equated it with the status of Lashon Kodesh. And that's the only foreign language that got that special yichus, that special upgrade status. So Gemara asks, Tani Yevonis Yevonim. In the Brisa says Yevonis, you could be Yotze, Liyevonim, only for Greeks who understand the language. No one else is able to be Yotze from Greek. And the Gemara answers, you're right, that Brisa represents the Shita of the Chachamim. Inu, but Rav and Shmuel, they accepted a different Shita. Amar ki Rav Shimon Gamliel, and Rav Shimon Gamliel is of the opinion that Greek is the only other language that's on par with Lashon Kodesh. It's now we learned in the Mishnah, Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, Af Sfarim lo hitiru sheikasvu ella Yevonis. The Sifrei Torah and Sifrei Nevi'im and Sifrei Ksuvim can only be written if it's not written in Lashon Kodesh, it can be written in Greek, because Rabbi Shimon Gamliel puts Greek on an upper status. It has the same status as Lashon Kodesh. So Gemara says, wait a minute, if Rav and Shmuel are singling out Greek as the only language that you could read the Megillah in, and even if you don't understand Greek, you could be Yotze, then later halacha like Rav Shimon Gamliel. Why don't you just simply outright straight away pass like Rav Shimon Gamliel? And Gemara says we would have misunderstood. I amri halacha like Rav Shimon Gamliel. If they would have simply said we pass like Rav Shimon Gamliel, havamina. Hani mili shar sfarim ava Megillah. Every single sefer Rav Shimon Gamliel will allow you to write in Greek, but there's one sefer that he will not allow you to write in Greek. There's Sivbe with regard to Megillah's Esther. Torah says Kik Sama, as they are written, meaning only in Lashon Kodesh. Is Amalo. I would say that if you wrote the Megillah in Greek, you're not Yotze, Kamash Malan. And Rav and Shmuel teach us that even according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, you could be Yotze even Megillah. According to Rav Shimon Gamliel, you could be Yotze even Megillah in Greek. And we're not going to take this word kiksamam as an exclusion of Greek. Now, in the note here, he says, Reb Shimon Gamliel completely invalidates the use of all languages other than Hebrew and Greek for other books of the scriptures. But with regard to the Megillah, he concedes that the use of other languages is permitted for those who understand those languages. That's derived from the pasuk V'am kilshono. The Mishnah says V'aloes shesham ashuris yatzam. I don't understand the word of Yashuris of Lashon Kodesh. I'm Yotze. I heard it, and I'm Yotze even though I don't understand. So the Gemara says, "Follow Yoda my command." The mitzvah of Mikra Megillah is to publicize the miracle. He doesn't understand a word of Hebrew. The Gemara answers, "Midavi anoshim v'ameoretz." This is not politically correct today, but apparently the women back in the time of the Gemara, they were very ignorant. They didn't understand Lashon Kodesh. Even the men, though, we'll see in a minute, didn't understand Lashon Kodesh. And they were ignorant people who didn't understand Lashon Kodesh. You tell me they don't fulfill their mitzvah Megillah when they come to hear the Megillah? Maskif lo Ravina. Ravina asked the following question. You wanted to prove something from Amaratzim. Don't even bother with Amaratzim. You're a Talmud Chacham. Let's see if you can understand the Megillah. Do we know what these words mean? No one understands these words. And yet we still fulfill our obligation. And the Gemara is now not sensitive to the fact that, this is only one phrase out of the entire Megillah. 99.9% of the Megillah I understand. You found one phrase that I can't understand. But apparently Gemara thinks that every word is part of the essential critical Kriyas HaMegillah. And if that be the case, then you cannot discharge your obligation unless you understand every single word. And we don't understand every single word. Ella, the final conclusion is mitzvahs kriya upersume nisa and hachinami mitzvahs kriya upersume nisa. Mitzvah is to read the Megillah, publicize the miracle, and if you don't understand the Hebrew, so you won't be part of the mitzvah persumanes, but you'll be part of the mitzvah kriya. And there's a basic, fundamental yisodi chiyuv of kriya, of reading the Megillah, even if it's divorced of persumanes. Here, Rashi has a big chiddush, and Rashi claims that since everyone else understands the Megillah, if you don't understand the Megillah, you will ask the other people, what's going on? They're reading a whole Megillah. It's a ganze Megillah. What's going on? So people will tell you what's going on, the great miracle, and that will be a kiyum of persumanes. Oh, I see. He quotes the Rashi. The Gemara says, let's look at the Mishnah Cross, Seirugin Yatsa. What does that mean? Lo aviyadi rabbanim. My Seirugin rabbanim didn't understand what the word Seirugin means. Now we're going to have a whole string of words in Tanakh that we don't understand, and with one exception, all of them we will figure out based on the maidservant of Rebbe. She was quite an outspoken woman. She knew languages. When the Talmidim came into the house of Rebbe, she would say to them, Rabbanan Davi Aile, Piske Lebe Rebbe. Then they came like one group, another group, a third group. And Masay attended Nasim, Serigin, meaning with interruptions. Why don't you come in all together as one? Another similar story. What is the word chalog logos in Mishnayos and Braisos, in Shvius and in Yomi? What does it mean? They heard Rebbe's maidservant, the Amro Leila, who Gavar, she said to us, man, Havi come and find their parpachine. Okay, parpachine, he says is purslane. And he was scattering purslane on Mosaya Tomafaser Chaloglocha. So you see that Chaloglogos is a reference to this thing called purslane, parparchi. Salsalea usromemel. Okay, we have now a pasuk in Mishnah. And they didn't know lo aviyadi rabbanan mai. What does it mean? What is a salsalel? Somebody overheard the maidservant of Rebbe, and the Havis Amrla Ugavar, she was speaking to a certain man, Navi Mahapech B'mazye. He was curling his hair. So she said to him, how long are you going to continue to be misalsel your hair, to curl your hair? Chazal say that, when Yaakov was in a state of grief and mourning, Yosef was making his hair look pretty. Lo havi yadi rabbanon, what does the pasuk mean? In Tilim it says, Hashlech al Hashem Yavecha. My father-in-law, may rest in peace, loved that pasuk. He also used to quote that pasuk. This is the only case where we didn't need the maidservant of Rebbe. We found it from an Arab merchant. V'kadarina tuna. I was carrying a load on my back. The Amrali, and he said to me, Shkol Yavicha, put down your load, Ushtei Agamli, and put it on my gamal. In other words, he was giving him a camel ride. So he said, why do you have to carry your package on top of your shoulders? Just put it on top of the camel. Just like imagine the famous story where you're in a wagon and you stop for someone, and an elderly Jew or whatever, and he's carrying a bundle, so he continues carrying it, but put it down on the wagon. And that's what it means to have bitochen Hashem. What does it mean in the pasuk in Yeshaya Hanavi? V'teitei sia b'mat ate matateh. Even a man in Hebrew, it's a broom. Shmeid. I shall tatate with the matate of destruction. So they heard the maidservant of Rebbe. She said to a friend, take this broom and sweep up the house. And we're going to have to see how long of an interruption there was between the time that he stopped until he continued reading the Megillah. And here we're going to turn to Daf Yud Ches Amid Beis.